comfortable because you can see that you're going to be doing work. You're going to be doing work. Could I just ask at the beginning, could you put your hand up if you were not in the EIPM session yesterday? Okay, quite a lot of you. If you weren't in the EIPM session, it's going to be helpful if somehow we're going to manage to pair you up with somebody who was. But I'll do my best. This is going to be a very interactive, very messy session. And it's billed as, I'm going to start by saying I'm not a specialist in indigenous knowledge. I work on evidence-informed policymaking. But what we've been working with is a framework, a conceptual framework for understanding how research evidence, research-generated evidence, can have an impact on policy and practice. And Christine, who's sitting here, is from 3IE and one of the authors of the conceptual framework sort of guidance note on the left-hand side. And there's a cohort of 57 projects funded by the British Academy that have been working with this conceptual framework. I would encourage you to read this. It's fantastic. It's really fantastic, and it really synthesizes everything that we know about how research evidence can have an impact on policy and practice. And I think it's important that as researchers we do have frameworks, and I was having a really interesting conversation with, I can't remember your name, about why, sorry, the conversation? With Kathy. I was having a really interesting conversation with Kathy about what a framework is and why we need it. And for me, the framework is a way of organizing evidence and ideas that you can use for advocacy, you can use to communicate. But I think in this instance, when we're thinking about the impact that research has on policy and practice, it's an accountability mechanism as well. It's a way of holding ourselves to account and a way of our funders holding us to account too. So I purposefully don't want to spend too much time on this framework. I don't want to talk you through it. Christine gave a fantastic synthesis of it yesterday, because what I want to do is explore it. And I want to use the collective wisdom in this room to kind of break it down and deconstruct it. And I think it's simple enough that these posters on the wall will make sense. The flip chart paper will make sense once you get into it. The first 5 minutes are going to be really confusing, but I think we will be able to work through it. So when we're talking about the impact, the outcomes of research on policy, there's a lot of fuzziness between terms. So just sit with that fuzziness. I know, as somebody who got a PhD recently, that being very, very clear about your terminology is of paramount importance, and I'm going to ask you to forget that just for the next 45 minutes, and then you can go back to being really competent academics. And I would say also that this is one of many frameworks out there, but this is a framework that has really done an extensive review of the literature and synthesized as much as possible. One of the critiques of the framework, and I don't know, Christine, do you want to say something about it being up for discussion?
Sure. Yeah. Tiny bit of background. So yes, this framework, for those that weren't attending the session yesterday, thank you, was developed by...
Let me turn it on. Yeah, that's good.
Was developed by a team at the FCDO Research Commissioning Centre, which is a research funder funded by the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. And it was intended to shape research on evidence-informed policymaking. And so, as Louise has mentioned, this is the initial framework, which is now being operationalized by a series of teams commissioned by the RCC as well as the British Academy. And I've had approaches from others who are starting to familiarize themselves with it as well. So it's really exciting to have this now out in the world and to be learning about researchers' experience using it. But as Louise mentioned, we're using this as an opportunity to really unpack it, really start to get researchers' experience using it, thinking about it. Are there situations for which it doesn't apply? Are there improvements that we can make to it? And so this is all going to feed into a learning process at the RCC and the British Academy, and potentially a new iteration of the framework that takes that feedback on board. So I think the exercise that Louise is going to use today is all part of thinking through this learning, but I'll pass back.
Thanks very much. So bring your deconstructive mind to this session, because I think one of the things that came out yesterday when we were looking at the framework was this is very apolitical. So we don't see politics in it. These dotted lines are contextual factors, but there's no sort of overt recognition of politics, of political economy, maybe of research ethics and things like that. And so what I want to do is explore, in particular, whether these are the pathways, relationships and networks, capabilities, structures and processes, evidence, culture. These are the outcomes in terms of changes to policy content, changes to policy procedures, changes in policy concepts, changes, attitudinal and behavioural changes in the policy environment. These are seen in this framework as the outcomes, and these are seen as the pathways. And in stress testing it, what I want you to consider is, what is the rationale for this to be structures and processes for this to be a pathway? If we consider different types of knowledge, if we consider indigenous knowledge, community knowledge, local knowledge, other forms of knowledge, does this framework still hold? Or, for different types of knowledge, might we say that the content of policy is actually a pathway to getting stronger relationships and networks with local communities? So, I should actually follow the slides.
You can take this and...
I can take that, okay. So, and I thought there was a very powerful statement that Professor Karaisha said today, which is that equitable outcomes show that value has been added to all and benefits of the partnership are shared. And so this is a process of questioning. How do we conceptualize? If we're using different types of knowledge, how do we conceptualize outcomes in terms of the effects that evidence has on policy and practice, and pathways in terms of the routes that we take to get those outcomes? Now, I'm also going to acknowledge there's a lot of fuzziness between terms here. So don't get too hung up about the definition of outcome versus impact. That's a whole other 45-minute session with many, many more flip charts and post-it notes. But what I want to do is just to get the collective wisdom for why we might consider structures and processes to be a pathway in some instances, and in other instances we might see that changes to structures and processes are an outcome. I think I can see a couple of people nodding, so I'm hoping that this is beginning to make sense, and I think as you work through the flip charts it should sort of come to light. So if we think about the orange blobs are the different types of knowledge. Again, a lot of fuzziness between them. The purple blobs are things that we need to consider as we work with these, and this is taken from a framework that is in development by Pax Africa. So if we consider that we're dealing with different ontologies, if we consider that that relational ethics are super important as we're dealing with these sort of non-research evidence, epistemic plurality, and our own positionality as researchers, considering all of these, I want you to take all of that into account as we move into the next very messy and very exciting phase. So what I've done here is to purposefully not tell you which of these are in that outer red circle and which are in the in a blue circle. I've just taken them and put random colours on them. And each one of them is written up on a flip chart. And what I would like you to do, and I'm going to suggest maybe you work in pairs, or you could even turn round and work in fours, so that I'm not going to start moving people around so to match up people who were in yesterday's workshop and who weren't. But if the front table sort of turns round and works with the second table, the third with the fourth, and so on all the way back, choose a topic that you would like to work on, and then on the, I've got this the wrong way around, on the flip charts, the yellow, I'm going to swap them around, the pink post-it notes, I would like you to just give me a sentence, and those who were in the workshop yesterday know that when I say write on a post-it note, please give me full sentences with verbs. Don't sort of write a note to yourself, because it's really hard to interpret other people's notes. So the yellow ones, because I'm going to flip them around, the yellow ones are going to be, why would you, the yellow ones are going to be, why would you view this as a pathway to another outcome? And the purple ones are, what is the rationale for viewing policy capability, let's say policy capabilities and capacities, as the outcome itself? Kathy.
If we're talking about equitable knowledge and decision making, so we're using policy as a word that's just one thing, and I'm not sure, is policy like, whose policy, or what do we mean by policy? I'm sorry if I'm confused.
No, absolutely. I should have said that.
If you can just clarify what we mean by policy and policy makers. Who are they and what is that?
I may come to policy. So these are decision makers at different levels, because some of you will be working with central government, some of you will be working with municipal government, some of you will be working with sort of county level government.
So
these
is policy always government, the state?
For today, yes.
Okay, that's helpful.
For today.
So we're working with
Okay.
the policymaker is the state. In
Because
whatever form.
this framework is about evidence-informed policy making. So for today, yes. Christine, are you happy with that?
Yes, I think
It will open up many, many more questions.
yes, the framework is designed for policymaking at government level, again, because it was designed to support research that we were commissioning in that space. I think having discussions around the framework has exposed other, obviously, contexts and types of knowledge and types of policymaking that aren't covered. I think it's helpful for this discussion, I guess, if we keep to those boundaries to understand the existing framework, but very open to understanding other applications and extensions.
Okay, has anybody got any other questions? Yes, Faith.
Thank you, Louise. So for the sake of the people who were not here, maybe yesterday, would it be helpful just to run through quickly the definitions of, like, for example, when you talk about policy capabilities and capacities, what is it in a nutshell? Like across, so that as we discuss, we know what we're discussing.
That was what I was going to do next. Oh, hang on, you've gone off the...
No, I was recording the meeting, but we can still go back.
Great. Okay. There we go. Great. Okay, thank you. So policy concepts are the ideas that are the ideas and the frameworks that are used in policy documents. I think that one's fairly simple. Policy content is what manifests in the documents. So there might be words or phrases or things But if you're looking at a policy at a strategy paper, for example, you can see the sort of the conceptual framing of a strategy paper, but then then there will be more detailed content in the document itself. And again, boundaries are fuzzy for all of this. The evidence culture, fairly amorphous, but this is about the willingness to use evidence, or the challenges that you might face when you are trying to engage with policymakers in using evidence. It's also things, policy making there may be a heavy emphasis on quantitative over qualitative evidence. There may be a heavy emphasis on evidence from business over evidence from local communities. It's the culture of the types of evidence that are prioritized and used in policy-making processes. It could also refer to the ease with which researchers communicate with policymakers, and the ease with which policymakers can be invited into research spaces and vice versa. What else? Policy relationships and networks. That's about the relationships with external partners, but it could also be the relationship between government departments. So we are working in a very fuzzy space, which is why my question is, do we need to delineate it quite that clearly, or do we need to have some flexibility in how this framework is being used? So that's what I'm trying to get to. Policymaking structures and processes are about the organizational aspects of policymaking. How does one department relate to another? This is more the institutional side of things and the process side of things. So are the mandatory policy processes very inclusive of different types of knowledge? Are they very open? Are they very fast? Are they very difficult to access? Does anybody really know about them, or does things all sort of happen in secret? Capabilities and capacities, that will be a lot around the extent to which the policymakers are familiar with evidence. In this case, focusing on evidence from local communities and indigenous knowledge, local knowledge, community knowledge, participatory knowledge. What have I missed? Attitudes and behaviours in policymaking. Again, I should have the document to hand, because they're fairly clearly defined. But attitudes and behaviours are, it'll be similar to evidence culture. So I think you will find there's a lot of sort of overlap between these things when we start interrogating it. I don't think was that it? I think I've covered all of them. And procedures is, I think that's more around institutionalization, isn't it? Yeah. Is there anything you want to add to that, Christine?
No, I don't think so. So some of these we had conceptualized as pathways, so ways to get evidence into policymaking. Some of them, as Louise mentioned, we conceptualized as policy outcomes. And so I think, the purpose of the discussion will be to unpack that a bit and understand, are there mechanisms? And also, I'd be very interested in if there are other pathways or outcomes that aren't on this list that you think are really relevant for this conversation. But definitionally, happy to also clarify if anyone has any questions about the definitions.
We've only got 25 minutes, so this is going to be the messy bit. If all that happens is you manage to get one post-it up on one of the flip charts, I'm still going to be really happy. Okay, I'm not expecting everybody to cover. So yesterday we had post-it notes over everything. What I'm more interested in is understanding why you think, when we're dealing with indigenous knowledge, community knowledge, local knowledge, participatory knowledge, would you see a change, would you see policymaking structures and processes as a pathway to achieving something else? Or would you see a change in policymaking structures and processes as the end result? Would you see a change in attitudes and behaviors in the policymaking process as a pathway to improved policy content? Or would you see that as an end result? Again, thinking not about research evidence, but about evidence that's coming from local communities and all the issues about relational ethics, about different ontologies, about, you know, epistemological justice. Is there epistemic justice? I can see a lot of very confused faces. It made sense to me at the time. It made a lot of sense to me at the time. Can I make a suggestion? Can I suggest that these back 2 rows talk about policy concepts? Okay, I think it's going to be easier. It's also easier for you to get here and not up the other end. So can you talk about policy concepts? So when you say that, you know, the conceptualization of an environmental policy has changed, the concepts that we can see in environmental policymaking has changed. Is that an outcome in itself, or is that a pathway to something else? Fiona, you look like you might be about to say something. Well, no, but exactly. So, what I've got here is the rationale for seeing it as an outcome, and the rationale for seeing it as a pathway to something else. Okay, that's what I'm interested in, is the rationale. So that takes care of those 2 rows there. Yes? No? Yes. 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 Exactly. Yeah. Yes. Yes. That's why I've put big post-it notes up rather than little ones. So in this particular context, we would view it as a pathway. In this particular context, we would view it as an outcome. So policy concepts, those 2 rows. These 2 rows, if this row can sort of turn round and work with that row, and can you do content? These 2, this is going to work brilliantly. These 2 rows, attitudes and behaviors. Okay? These 2, okay, it's not going to work brilliantly. These 2 rows. I missed a couple at the back. Maybe the couple at the back can come up to the front. So you do these 2 rows. No, sorry, where were we? These 2 rows, structure. You're on attitudes and behaviors. Procedures and structures and processes. Okay, and so this slot, you can do evidence culture, and anybody else who wants to talk about evidence culture can come up here. Let's leave networks and relationships for now. We can talk about that later. I think let's just focus on 1. So it's going to be messy. Andrew, you're looking horrified. Thank you. We're going to hand out the post-its. Form yourselves into groups.